And I want to welcome all of you, Baruchot Habaot, as they would say in Hebrew, to a group of women, to the second of 4 Women's League Reads virtual events of 5781. We welcome so many of you from Canada, the United States, and possibly 1 or 2 from Israel, despite the early morning hour. Merle and I enjoy organizing and sharing these events with all of you. We tend to use Google Group and the Women's League Week messages to inform you of these events. Please contact me and I'll type into the chat box my email address in a few moments if you have any suggestions, requests, and questions about Women's League Reads. For housekeeping, as I mentioned a few moments ago, we're recording this interview and it will be posted on the Women's League for Conservative Judaism website on the Women's League Reads page. I'm going to try to manage the time, and we're going to perhaps be for about an hour with this virtual conversation with Sarah Blake, and the chat box questions and comments you may share. I'm going to introduce our guest author, Sarah Blake. And
hi.
Hi. I think everybody has been muted now, and only 3 people are able to speak at this point in time. So our guest author, Sarah Blake, who was born in New York City, presently lives in Washington, D.C. She's taught school and college level English before achieving success as a novelist. The guest book, the book we're discussing this evening, is her 3rd novel of historical fiction after having written in 2001 Grange House and in 2010 The Postmistress. She's published a collection of poems which is called Full Turn in 1989 and collaborated with Robin Kahn on a book called Runaway Girls that was published in 1997. I understand that Ms. Blake also leads fiction writing workshops and composes reviews and essays for varied print media. I turn it over to Merle to pose the questions that Merle has prepared for our conversation. Thank you so much.
I'm going to let Sarah speak first for a little while and maybe do a short reading, and then we will continue with questions. Sarah?
Hi, everybody. I mean, as always, you guys sort of know each other a little bit and by Zoom or whatever, but the Zoom is great to be able to just pull us all together on one screen, but it is always very odd because here I am just kind of looking and seeing, and I wish we were all in a room together because words have life when, you know, real people are in a room. The words are different. They land differently. I just thought that today, especially on Martin Luther King Day, what I wanted to do, I'm going to talk just very briefly sort of about how I came to write this book, what were the sort of seeds that grew into this, 500-page family novel. But and then I wanted to just read just a little bit from the book, just to hear. I'm going to read a teeny bit that in the voice of Reg, who is the African-American character who comes to this family that is at the center of the guest book, comes to their place in Maine, and his thinking, especially today. I just thought I'd read. And then Meryl and I had talked a little bit last week. We're just going to go wherever we go. I love answering questions. I love hearing what you have to say or think, and so I am up for wherever we go. But just to start off, just to put us all kind of in the same page. But you should know, this is, as Susan said, my 3rd novel. I have always my whole life wanted to write a big, fat, juicy family novel, very much in the vein of Isabel Allende's House of Spirits or Virginia Woolf's The Years, or of course the Forsyte Saga, which I just devoured and probably read 3 times. because I just wanted to, I love the kind of overlapping plot lines and ways in which repetitions start to go through generations, how you carry on through the years. I knew, though, that if I ever did get to do that, I wanted to write a novel that somehow approximated the experience of being in Tom Stoppard, the British playwright, in the theater when you see his play Arcadia. So if any of you have seen Arcadia, it came out in the 90s. It was first put on then. And it tells the story of one family over two time periods, 1816 and the present. And it takes place, literally, it alternates scene to scene. In the set is the country house. So you have these two plot lines from past and present building, but you're separated by time, but the space confines you. So you literally have characters from 1816 walk over to a window, say something out of it, and pick up a teacup and sip. And in the next scene, you see the generation that's 200 years later repeating those same gestures. So you are literally watching the way in which time and space collapse in history and in a family. And I thought that when I first saw that, I just thought, oh my God, that I just want to do that, because as far as I'm concerned, that's the best way to represent the pathos of history, when the past and the present are always going on, simultaneously, one on top of each other. And the past doesn't know what's coming, and the present doesn't know what's past. And it seemed to me, especially, it's a great way to tell a family story, the way in which we echo and repeat our parents and grandparents without knowing that we're doing that, because we don't fully know who they are. But the place remembers, just thinking of that. So all of this is going on, in my sort of aspirational head as I'm finishing The Postmistress. And it's 2008, and Obama gives his major first speech on race in his candidacy, April 2008. And in it, he reminded us, he evoked William Faulkner's phrase, which all of you, I'm sure, have heard many times, saying, the past isn't dead in this country. It isn't even past. And Obama was eliciting Faulkner to just sort of remind us that our collective racial past was going to be activated and queued up by his candidacy, thereby putting race and our sort of historical, our country's sort of family memory of race right on the surface of the conversation. And so this is 2008, this is 12 years ago, and so much has happened since then. But then I remember hearing that speech as a kind of call to arms and a real inspiration, because I had grown up not talking about race in the same rooms with African-American people. The silence and the lack of that conversation was very much the soup I grew up in. And so I took that to heart, what he was saying, and knew that I wanted that whatever this family novel became, I wanted to tackle that question, especially why in this country is the past not past? What keeps the past present? And so the more I'm thinking about this, and I have what you see behind me actually are all the notes of the novel I'm working on now. This is I just have bare walls. And ahead of me, over my computer, are all these quotes that I've always sort of written by. And one of the quotes, actually both of the quotes that are the epigraphs for the guest book, are right here above my head. And one of them is James Baldwin's sentence from 1953 from A Stranger in the Village, in which he says, people are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. And the more I looked up at that, and it's been above my writing head since I was in college, the more I looked up at that, the more I thought, maybe that's a way to answer this question. Why is the past not past? what keeps the past present? Maybe this is a way to think about how this novel will answer my sense of what Obama was calling us to pay attention to. What if I took it literally, thinking about the history inside us, in each of us, and then thinking about if I take that literally, well, all the questions that begs, like whose history, which history? Is it possible to spring that cage? What's the trap? What causes the trap? And the more I started to think about that, I thought, if memory is history inside that we carry in our body, then it seems like the half-truths of family memory that are passed down half-told in every family, creating the kind of mythos that we live or that a family lives by. Maybe that was a way to think about how we pass on this country's memory, how we carry this country's memory inside us, thinking about the ways in which we repeat our parents and grandparents without knowing it. How is it that we are, in fact, carrying forward, repeating our country's grandparents and that history inside us unknowingly? How is it that we're going about doing that? So I'm thinking then that this novel will be a way to actually ask the questions about past and present and think about a family as a kind of metaphoric structure for our collective family memory. And again, thinking about past and present. At this point, too, I was very much wanting to think about my own family, to really sort of interrogate my place in Baldwin's trap, the trap of history. I am completely WASP, old-moneyed, white, obviously. The more and more I thought, I was like, what is the history inside a family like mine? And what would a novel look like that played that out over time? So if you've read it, you know that the guest book moves back and forth in time between 1930, 1950, and the present. It follows one family and generally moves just in two places, the house that is the kind of, or the island that situates that family, and the island of Manhattan. And it follows the family, the three generations of the family, as they kind of play out something that is told and half told and not told all the way through the generations. So that's sort of what brought me to writing. I think what I'd love to do is just read this little bit, just again to be sort of putting some of the words just up in front of us. The Stumblestones of Berlin were very pivotal to me in figuring out how to actually write the book. And maybe, Meryl, you and I can talk about that after I read. It's sort of a lot right now, but I just wanted to put in front of you how the book came to be, and then read, and then we'll go from there. So I'm going to read a section right towards the end. This is the sort of where all of the generations, the 50s and the 30s, are together. It's a night in 1959. It's a party, an engagement party for the youngest daughter of the Miltons, and it's on this island where many people have come from the neighboring islands, and they're having a lobster dinner, and then a square dance, and it's a night that ends up basically cracking open the myth of the Miltons. Moss Milton, who is the son in 1959, who very much wants to be a jazz musician, a composer, but is about to stop his music in order to take up the family business, which is banking. He invited sort of casually his new friend, Reg Pauling, who's an African-American writer, and Reg's best friend, Len, who's Jewish, who is, unbeknownst to everybody there, deeply and secretly in love with Joan, the eldest daughter of the Miltons. So it is in the tradition of great family novels, the sort of where all the plots combine, but they're combining at a party on the rocks, on the island, 8 miles offshore, off the mainland from Maine. And And Moss is a singer. He's part of an a cappella group, and that whole, the 1950s and a cappella figure very highly in here. So this is Reg watching as Moss is singing with the sort of group behind him. And imagine you're at a party. It's there's a fire. And it's at dusk. Reg watched the glow on Moss's face as he sang. How music filled him. How Moss believed with all the breath in him, in every note he sang, note by note, as if the world could be built on air and sound. As if the problems of the world might be solved by men like these, ranged in a tight circle, leaning into the notes sung together, swelling upward into the twilit sky. He knew that this was Moss's dream, and he remembered that night long ago when he'd stumbled on Moss singing just such a song, sending note after note into the air, and believing that was enough. And yet Reg's life, Reg's parents' life, were nowhere in those notes, not even buried. Here, on this island, in the middle of the Atlantic, he was surrounded by the best and the brightest, the men who ran and who would run this country, and who would never lay a hand on him, but who could change the laws if they could see. And they wouldn't. Reg saw the limit fully in this singing. Moss sang as if the gates of the world could open with him, believing with all his heart that they could. But here, on the island, the care with which Reg was being handled, the pronounced attention, was merely the opposite face of the face that gave the hard stare, or the push between the ribs, or the whip. Both faces turned to the black man as though to a wall that had to be climbed or knocked down, and always with the infinitesimal moment of wariness that slid immediately into anger or polite regard, as if to say, "Oh, you again." This was what he wanted to rip into. This was why Reg thought he'd come, why he'd made this trip over in a lobster boat in part for this, to hear what always went unvoiced, and to make Moss see that, to make Moss see. But watching Moss singing, the vast uselessness of what he was after caught Reg there around the fire. Seeing was not enough. Speaking was not enough. Doing even was not enough. He could tear it down for Moss and for Len, he thought, as Len moved beside him. And there'd be satisfaction in it, but little joy. Joy, the word floated up as Mrs. Milton caught his eye. He held her gaze a moment, and she nodded at him, and he looked away. He shuddered. She was, perhaps, the worst of them all. So I'm going to end there. And
all right, so this book, I have to say, so many things to discuss, and hard to know how to put it into order. So I guess I'm going to take it sort of back to the beginning, even though that really, I mean, that is to be here today on Martin Luther King Day discussing this is like a great connection. But I guess I want to take it back.
Serendipity in a sense.
Right. Without planning. We didn't plan that. So I just want to take it back, I guess, to the beginning and to Kitty and Ogden. So this book, you start with the Holocaust. In your other book, The Postmistress also is using the Holocaust as the I can't think of what the word is, but as the vehicle. What is your connection to that? Why bring that into this book then, instead of just starting, let's say, in the 50s? Or what made you bring in this Jewish connection?
Well, so I always knew one of the things, I mean, the book sort of, as my books always do, I feel like I have a very simple story and then I start writing it and it becomes, just sprawling and gnarled and completely intertwined. I always knew that what I wanted to do was think about specifically anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism I had grown up in my family. And so I knew that the sort of secret, or the central plot at the middle of the family novel was going to be a love affair in the 50s between a Jewish man and one of the daughters. So it was always, and because I really was, I wanted to really think about the ways in which, the so-called casual anti-Semitism, which is a phrase that I had, again, grown up in, which just makes no sense to me now. It's like, what does that even mean? But, the ways in which it was, not that it was forgivable, but that it was just, it was the norm. It was like, that's just how we are as WASP. That's how we, just that. And so I really, I really did want to think about, what kind of history was in me, the ways in which, and I'm married to a Jewish man. I have 2 sons, and we did their bar mitzvahs, and but so just all the again, thinking about history inside us, like how is it that you can see the way the sort of how you're always carrying a kind of historical EYE with you. So but then Reg appeared. He appeared, and I realized that I wanted, the Obama sort of story that I told is true. I wasn't sure that I was going to directly address it, but then Reg, the character, literally appeared on the dock in, as I'm writing, which is often how things happen. And I realized, oh, okay, here we go. And so the that was the sort of always central was going to be, I thought the novel was going to be the 50s and the present. Mm-hmm. And then the more I was writing the 50s, and especially the anti-Semitism, and doing research, it was impossible not to see the ways in which the 30s and the sort of, again, the complicity, the ways in which silence and passivity, and again, the sort of look away anti-Semitism, how that was rooted in the 30s. And so Kitty and Ogden, who initially had just been the people who'd bought the island, the grandparents, became major characters in their own right. And or not even in their own right. Like I realized that the sort of nugget of what was going to be happening had to start there. And in particular, the ways in which both of them would have been shocked by the thought that they were anti-Semitic, that they were bad, and Ogden's, the way in which he has his sort of justification for investing in German steel, from what I can see and from what I sort of can remember, would have been, it was very much consistent with the kind of businessman sense that you want to keep Germany stable. So you're not making that same kind of connection. Again, it's not forgivable, but it's deniable. It's that gray area I was really interested in. And Kitty also. Kitty's, so it's not that I wanted to tackle the Holocaust. It was more that again, always, I set my novels always in the time periods before the historical moment. So Postmistress, if those of you who read it, was set in 41, before we entered the war. Right. And this one too, it's like, it's 35, 36. There's still that sense of, not that the Nazis aren't that bad, but there's a way in which it still seems, again, deniable is not the right way, but you can still sort of maintain a kind of distance. 59 also, I wanted to really think about race and class when there still was very staunch white Anglo-Saxon kind of hegemony. but all the cracks were there. All the crack, 19, the women's room, like all, the pill is in production in 59. There's so much that's about to blow forward into the 60s or blow onto the surface. So that's an incredibly long way of answering the question.
No, that's no, because so to me, Kitty is from the very beginning, because now also she just keeps building things that she has to keep secret. Everything that she does, she has to keep secret. So we start with Nettie, which was such a shocking start. And she keeps that secret to all the way. No one ever knows about him in the modern day, Evie and none of her cousins, that none of them ever even know he ever existed. And then she keeps secret mostly from most of them, but she keeps the car. She carries this car, so she remembers it. And then she keeps secret when Elsa asks her to take Willie, and she doesn't. But then in the end, you find out that she's gone and she's been trying to find him all this time. Mm-hmm. So how hard that is on somebody to have to keep all those things secret to yourself instead of being able to share them with somebody.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way, everything I write, all my books have to do with silence, and how silence both obviously protects, but also is a massive guard. A portcullis that comes up. It's also a way to keep people out, like the code of silence that is, otherwise known as manners, which, this novel, there's very much that sense of what you do and don't do, but you never speak of it. That's a way to, as always, that's the way to know, to sort of signal who's in the club and who's not. And certainly in terms of class, and Kitty practices that 100%. I think that part of what's her, again, these are definitely not my, family, but that kind of not speaking of terrible things is very familiar to me. I don't think it's just WASP. I think there are a lot of ways in which, you can, that kind of silence, corrosive, but protective at the same time, that's carried down. What's carried down is, again, that's one of those great things where what's kept quiet is, in some senses, is spoken without ever given name, because of the way in which, let's say, Kitty behaves in X, Y, or Z. That you don't know that that's what's actually going on there. I think maybe this is a good time to link it to the Stumblestones, because what happened with Elsa, that scene with Elsa, which in my head is very much the kind of center of, that's the nugget that reverberates, all outward, and especially, I think it was, I wanted to figure out how I could show history both being hidden and told. It seems to me that is how we keep the past, present, because it's always actually going on, but we're also saying, oh, but that's not it. It's something else. So when my husband, as I say, well, no, I didn't. He's a poet, and he won this prize that was a fellowship that basically gave us some the sort of time and money to for a year. The only stipulation was that we had to leave the country. And so we chose to go to Berlin. And so that our two sons, the four of us went, and I didn't speak German. I still don't. And we were, in Berlin. Those of you who've been to Berlin know that is a city that is just speaking its history on the surface all the time, and especially, within the last 20 years. And the sort of testifying of the buildings, it's where the place literally is holding in place memory and keeping the past and the present constantly in view. So it was incredibly powerful, just for me. I went there with about 2 years of the novel just still percolating, but I still didn't really I had no idea how I was going to tell this story. I knew that I was going to have all these levels and there was going to be this love affair, but it was really actually walking around following the stumble stones, which those of you know are the brass paving stones that are, literally this big, that have been set in the pavement by an artist. It was an artist project begun in '92 that literally just memorialized. They're set outside the last place a Jewish family lived or worked, and they mark who lived there, and they testify not only to their names and their birth dates, but also they tell what happened. They were taken at this date and murdered in Auschwitz, or they were they committed suicide here. I mean, the language is completely unsparing. It's literal, but the point is they are holding the moment that something happened right there. So when you're standing there looking down, you are actually in the spot where that thing happened. And for me, this was just tremendously just inspiring, and also opened up all sorts of things, because the past trips up the present. You cannot move. It makes the past concrete in a stone. And so what it asked you to do is, or certainly what I started to do is like, who would I have been in that moment that this stone marks? Would I have been, the woman in the window looking down? Would I have been the man going by? Would I have been the boy on his bicycle? Who would I have been then? Which begs the question, who am I now in relation?
So that was one of the things I was going to ask you is, in the book, you have Evie ask her class, if you were a Jewish person came to you and asked you to hide them in 1939, what would you have done? Did you think about that answer for yourself? And did that answer for you change possibly before and after you wrote the book?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think, I think sort of if I had been in Evie's class, I would have been like, well, of course I would have, and I mean, I think that this is the thing that was most important to me about writing the book, was that it forced me to actually just do the work of thinking, of sort of implicating myself. Would you have been? What would you, I mean, just, it stopped me. It forced me to stop and not just give the pat answer, or not even pat, but just the answer that you hope that would be true.
Right.
Yes, I would hide. But, when you're in that, and when you're in the place where it happens, there's a way in which the embedded, the embodied past really calls you out. And I think what the book did was, over the course of writing it, just made me more and more and more aware of all the layers of my own blindness and my own sort of wish to be, to be the person who would, like, just to make the analogy, like, what if there had been a stumble stone here in this country put down for every single place an enslaved person had been sold or resold? Again, who would I have been in that moment? If we had in this country had memory fixed like that, literally literalized, how would that change the way in which we remember what our collective sort of racial memory? And that's in part what the book started to become, where it's like, I'm going to actually make a stumble stone, and bury it in here, thinking very much about that as a mechanism to force the way in which past and present are going on all the time in us. Do you know what I mean? Like, so, right. And in terms of race, and myself as a white person, who would I have been, and who am I now? So.
So is this, in the end, is the Stumblestone that rock where Joan wants her ashes buried? Does that become the Stumblestone for the family?
In some ways. I mean, I'm thinking actually of like the fact that I buried Kitty's secret in, basically in an open grave, meaning like everybody, you, the reader, sees that everybody's stumbling around, that there is this moment that is active and varied and forces that the past and present are always kind of working on because of just what you said about Kitty carrying it. And so it was really more of that I was thinking, but it was more that understanding that if I buried something in the book that was an open secret, but not known to anybody else except for us, that was the way to do what the Stumblestones did in Berlin for me.
Okay. So also some other interesting things that you bring up are the whole issue, and you said, like the pill or the birth control was just starting, that also you bring in the topic of Joan working for the publisher who's trying to bring Lady Chatterley's lover. So we're like on the precipice maybe of, I don't know if it was, well, feminism a little bit because she's going to go off and get a job. But also this whole like new sexual age, I guess, of breaking this barrier to bring Lady Chatterley's lover. I thought that was interesting. I have to just say, I loved the little quote, reach for a lucky instead of a sweet. I don't know, anybody in this call is old enough really to have remembered that, but I have watched old shows where they used Lucky cigarettes as a
Lucky
dieting
Strikes.
tool, and now we look at that and think how unbelievable that is.
Well, that's because Merle, that was because the rationale for that was smoking suppresses appetite.
I know. Right.
So that's the rationale behind it. Merle, can I just piggyback on a thought that Sarah alluded to in the book with the book and her rationale for why she created certain mechanisms in the storyline. I think it's very laudable that you bring up the idea of upstander, bystander, what an upstander being someone who's going to speak out and do something when they see something that is perhaps ethically or morally problematic, or seeing the degrading or the harm to somebody, or character assassination that we may be witnessing at times today with the rhetoric that's being bandied about, and versus bystanding, which a lot of people did, and that the Stolpenstein of the stumbling stones in Berlin, and I've been fortunate to be in Berlin before the wall came down and since, but I just think it's interesting how the Stolpenstein or stumbling stones, and how you created the island as like the stumbling stone in this novel for this family to come to terms. But I think that there are, it's kind of interesting how there were several things that the family had to come to terms with, not just their treatment of other people, but the kind of interactions of each other and how they demonstrated their connection, their love for each other. It was kind of a very, and the connections they had with other people, how they've, in some ways, I think at times you sense that they treated other people a little more kindly than their own family members. I mean, and I read the book a while back and I didn't reread it like Merle has. So my memory could be wrong, but it's just something I was left with. And I don't know if it's making sense when I'm kind of how I'm bringing this up at this juncture of the conversation in terms of being upstanders and bystanders and knowing how to react and knowing when to speak up and knowing that you can't speak up and being forced to feel you can't, because I think some of the ways some of the characters feel that way.
Yeah, and I think that it's definitely, I mean, what you're sort of circling around too is the the currency in this family, the thing that they all both sort of keep and the way that the machine, the engine, let's say more, is silence, is the way, they in fact, their loyalty and their devotion, as you're describing, is keeping the code. And even though they can see, I mean, certainly Joan and Moss can see the really the sort of dictatorial nature of that code. They want to escape it, but in fact can't. And I think, again, for me, I recognize that, and the pathos of that, of the people who can see but can't stand up yet, that who you're bringing up, and in some ways, perhaps again, the kindness that you're talking about, is there's no way for them to see how to stand up. And Evie, who is the third generation, who's as Meryl was saying, she's a history professor. She's a history professor who doesn't know her own history, and I think this is something that, again, I'm really thinking about the machinery of how we perpetuate, the sort of this inability to stand up, which would be a stumblestone, right? That would be the way to interrupt the interrupt the present and stop, the ways in which it keeps carrying forward. And I mean, one of the things I do think about is the difference, certainly for me, between Berlin's exteriorizing of what happened and our own country's inability to do that until lately. I mean, really, obviously, the enormous, the lynching memorial. There's all kinds of things now that are approximate or look like the kind of work that the Stumblestones were doing, where in its own country there is a way in which there's a physicality of memory that does the same thing. Like but you have to ask yourself, would you be a bystander or an upstander? And because things are being literalized in a way that wasn't true even 10 years ago. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
I think what you're talking about is like how to move into upstanding.
Yeah. And I think in retrospect, when I see, my mother was a Holocaust survivor. I mean, she was in the camps and such, and her personal strength, I look at, in retrospect, she's not living anymore, but every Holocaust survivor that I have interacted with in Germany and here, because I had a chance to live in Germany for 10 years, and a year in England. And I just think that they had this tremendous strength that I honestly feel, no matter how strong people see I may be, I just don't think it's as strong as that generation's strength and of character and of being able to do things that I think for many of us would be very challenging things to do.
So someone asks, I just glanced at the
questions,
and someone is asking, do you think that we're becoming more open with our family histories? And I guess what I was thinking, just tying to that, is that there are some survivors that don't talk about their experience in the Holocaust, but there are so many, especially as they get toward the end of their life, that feel that it's very important to share their stories now, especially as we have less and less survivors. So maybe talking a little bit about that, do you think that people are sharing more now of their stories?
I don't know. No. I mean, I don't know. I do have a feeling that there's an openness that is new. I mean, so I don't really know how to answer that about people's families, but I'm thinking about the way in which, because of the pandemic, there's a sense that there's a sense of the sort of collective in a way that I don't feel like there was before this, and somehow that has, it seems to me, put more onto the surface, just the way, just all of our histories and who we are, sort of in this. And I'm thinking in particular of the kind of crazy and beautiful Democratic National Convention, where you saw so many people by Zoom, at their kitchen table or standing on a rock or whatever. And, obviously it was created and architected. I mean, it was curated and all that. But I think that is something, it's not really answering your question, but there's a way in which I feel like there's more on the there's more of us on the table than ever have been before, and more, or sort of on the visual table. And somehow that seems to be opening, it's like, I now have in my head, I can't even remember who, he was a guy who was sitting at his table talking. And so I could imagine his family history. I didn't even know I couldn't even have envisioned him before. So, but anything else would just be anecdotal, actually, so I don't know. Hey, because I saw somebody asked on the chat very early on, asking about what page that reading, that I read from.
Oh, yeah.
In the hardback, it's 417. I don't know what 417 to 418. I'm not sure what it is in the paperback.
Yeah. Ellen Tillman was very gracious to answer that question from her copy. So,
good.
Merle, did you have other questions, or do you want me? I've written down 2 to 3 questions from our audience.
Go ahead.
So Ellen Tillman, who gave the page citation, she has written something. Thanks to you, in your acknowledgement section, you thanked Harold Janeway and George Montgomery for holding on to the island. Was there an island in your family? Is her question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in many ways, as I said, this is, I wanted to think about the sort of history inside a family like mine. The characters are fictional, but the one sort of purely autobiographical and probably the most truthful thing in this novel is the island. My grandparents did go sailing and buy an island in 1935. And so that, and that really has been always the kind of touchstone for me, both as a writer and then, growing up. We were the family that had an island, and all of what that implies. And so much of this novel is sort of rendering the power of a place to sort of bind and define you. And in particular over many generations, what a place can become and how a place shifts. So yes.
Thank you. Molly Ann Blumenthal noted that as she was reading, she marked in her book examples of some idea of making or breaking the sense of entitlement, what expectations your family has for you or your circle of friends, as well as the rules that can be made and broken. And I think you did some elaboration earlier, but if there's some additional idea of how you felt that was so important to describe in the way you wanted to. If I remember, I'm trying to bring this back to your concern with the past and the present, and you can't, so because they have a legacy of expecting things, or as Kitty, the grandmother, has all these rules that are spoken and unspoken. That's kind of the legacy that Kitty gives to her children. That's the past that she hands them, so to speak. So I think that's why there's so much sense of entitlement, expectations, rules to be made, rules to be broken, that filter throughout the scenes, the flow of the story. And I think that's what this person wanted to have some confirmation if she's understanding it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said, I think, manners are some of the best, they're kind of the velvet gloves of, how we keep codes and how we keep some people in and some people not out, and how you mark a kind of social strata. And I was really interested in watching, so for example, when you're saying like Kitty passes down, she's got very specific rules, like some things are better off left unsaid. When you think about that literally, that's like, that packs a wallop. But she passes that down, and you can see the generations either repeat it or enact it or work against it. But I was interested in that, the ways in which a family's, entitlement is the sense that it is actually born out of the sense that the rules that you live by will never end, because you're actually doing the right thing, the best thing. You have, you're the group that runs the country, and the country should be given into your hands because you have just been, this is what you've been doing. And so there's the sense that then you hold on to that, and you make sure that it gets passed on in the same way. Like that entitlement is connected to a sense of, you've got to stay within, you got to ride the same pony. You got to keep those, the bit in your mouth in that same way. So that's the way in which I think that the sort of sense of entitlement and the continued entitlement is aided by manners and rules and discipline.
So Kitty says at one point, we enter every room with a smile. We speak to everyone regardless of their place as another human being, a reasonable person, so as to create an atmosphere of goodwill. And that's the best defense against people who haven't been brought up to know better. And she sets those parameters. And then even all the way down at the end, when Evie and Min come, they can quote those back to each other. It's right. It's like embedded in the family through the generations of how you're supposed to behave and how you're supposed to.
And also, yeah, absolutely. And then how you find yourself both continuing it, because, on the face of it, that's a great way to, that is good. You should enter every room and treat everybody as though they're human. But the difference between the way in which Evie might enter that room and the way Kitty does, because Kitty enters that room also maintaining the grace, the graciousness. So this is what's so complicated. I think, again, back to this question of upstanding and bystanding. We're all just a big mess. Everything, the good and the really, insidiously bad, are absolutely all linked in the same drawing room, right? Kitty is not, when she says, when she looks at Reg when he arrives, and she's like, oh, it's as small as this. He's just a black man and I'm a white woman and we can talk together. And so there is a sense that because she does believe in treating everybody as human, but then at the same time, look what she tells him. That's where, this notion of what racism looks like. It looks like that, where it's absolutely genuine sitting on the bench, and absolutely genuine not actually treating him the way that you would, somebody else. And I wanted, with Elsa, Kitty's anti-Semitism really had so much to do with the fact that Elsa was too much. She was, right. It wasn't even just that she was she was asking way over what was, in a way it was like not proper, but then it's masking, her own thing of like, well, her own sorrow, because of course, how can you replace your child? But also Nettie, Willie is not Nettie. Willie is a little Jewish boy. So all that's, I really wanted to somehow have that all on the surface, right. And so you can see the layers of people acting, in their head reasonably, honorably.
So can you mention that what's behind you is the notes for the next,
Oh, yeah.
which we can't read from here, but can you give us a clue of?
Yeah, I'm working on a novel that's actually set in the present right now in Washington, D.C. It involves a group of spies, women, and it centers around a document from Reconstruction that has the power, has the capacity to actually explode this country wide open. And so it's a again, thinking about history and silence, and most of all, it's really fun to write a spy novel. So it's like really complicated. The Russians are in there, and I'm having I don't even know how to describe it, but every time I write a scene, then it actually happens out there, and I just am like, oh my
Isn't
God,
that
it's
scary?
Like, yes, and also, so, okay, so now what am I writing? So, but no, it's a spy novel about a group of women.
So you do research and you take notes and pin them up and then move them around, or why do you, how do you?
I don't know. I just feel like I've got to, like, all my thinking, I need room, because like this over here, I might be using over here. I just need to see it. So it's just a mess. It's not at all like I'll do this and then this and then this. It's more just like, if I can put everything up, and it's not just, because usually I just write in a notebook, but then everything's caught in a page. Like if I can just spread it out, it helps, and I'll just look at it. I guess it's like if I were doing a painting where, you stand in front of a painting. Those of you who paint know this, and I can see, oh, this detail, it's in front of me. So I can, you see both the process and also the possibility. Yeah.
Any other questions, Susan, or?
Oh, yeah, there's quite a few that have popped in the last minute or two relating back to Kitty and Elsa, if I can. So I'll kind of pull the three together because it's about that. So Sarah Wunsch from Toronto is asking, is it Kitty's anti-Semitism, or is it her loyalty to her perception of her husband's response or disdain for Elsa? And then, let me see here, it's just popped a little. Is that what ultimately governs her decision regarding not accepting Willie into her household to save him from the Nazis? And then Kitty's angry that Elsa's son is alive and hers isn't, is a comment from Helene Imber that everyone can see. And Amy Mayer sent this to me, but I'm willing to share it. I hope it's okay with Amy. But she's curious because we know from earlier chapters that Ogden is going to Germany for banking with Elsa's father, and they spend time. There's that one scene where they're in the one of the major parks of Berlin that's still around today, and so. And then, was there actually an affair? Are we supposed to interpret that they knew each other and had an affair because of Ogden being so many times in Berlin for business? So those three questions come together.
Okay, well, so all three of those things are in play, as often happens in really important moments in all of our lives. Kitty's answer, those are the three things that are, in her head, whether consciously or not. It's very clear that she feels threatened by Elsa. And that in some way, she says, she's thinking, there's definitely some connection between them, but that Ogden doesn't like her. You hear her thinking, right. She's watching. It's also drives her crazy that Elsa is able to sit on the veranda with her little boy falling asleep in her arms. That's just the most delicious moment. And so Nettie's, and he's very similar in age. The loss of Nettie is achingly, sort of present at the same time. So Elsa is doubly, threatening in that way. And her anti-Semitism is also overt. I mean, you hear her say he's a small Jewish boy. So again, that's the terrain that I'm interested in, where it's all three of those things. And that this is what's in play. So, and that's what's important, to me. That was important to me to try. Like, I wanted to try and write a novel with those kind of characters, with that.
Thank you. Okay, another question that just popped in is from Marcia Belgorod, the role of the anchoress in the book.
Oh,
yeah. Is it too late to ask about that?
No, but why don't we, that's a great place to sort of end, because so the anchoress, it's the title of the first section, the anchoress. And I think Evie talks about who an anchoress is, but this was, again, early on in the writing of this. I live in DC. I have friends who teach at Georgetown. I was at a party with some Georgetown professors, and this one woman, a professor of medieval history, was talking about anchoresses, which I had never heard of. And, these women who were walled into the side of monasteries and very much were the kind of, again, literal embodiment of the faith, the strength of the faith of that institution. So you have a woman being buried as the sort of beating heart of this enormous of a monastery, of this is sort of the Christian patriarchy. And besides the fact that it's a fantastic metaphor for the position women have often in, the sort of larger institution, and especially of silence. She did not speak. She was this kind of revered treasure, but she, was walled in and spent her entire life there and died there. And there's the anchoring rules. There's a lot of literature that comes out of these anchoresses. Anyway, when I heard about that, I just was like, okay, that's just too good. And it made me really think about, in what way is Kitty an anchor? How are the women in these novels both anchoring the the sort of larger historical moment that they're in, but and then how are they also breaking out of it? Do they have, and Evie is overt because she's in the 80s she writes her whole thing about whether or not that silence is power. And as she gets older, she comes to think that actually it's not. She's just a woman buried alive. And that, at one point, this is one of my favorite lines because I'm also of this age. It's like, metaphors for the young. Because in fact, this really is a woman who's just, the literal situation is not anything pretty, even though it's been, turned into this, this kind of great source of power. So again, we're back to the potency of silence. And what do women do with their silence? So in my case, I did not follow my grandmother, who, Kitty's edict about some things are better off left unsaid. I just paid no attention to that clearly and just broke all kinds of silences everywhere. So, and maybe that's where we should end.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We really enjoyed it. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for
look forward to your next book.
All together.
And there's some very appreciative comments in the Zoom chat, and people can't wait to read the book. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you everybody. That was fun.
And thank you for joining us and sharing so much and so beautifully about the inspiration and how and in some ways history is definitely something that is in a way trapping us today in what we see going on out there and what's being reported, and especially in the last few months. It's, I think in retrospect, as we get older, we'll see this as a very momentous time period.
For sure.
So
right now we see it that way.
Yes.
Thank you very, very much. It was wonderful.